international echo field what we have. Okay, so as I was telling you, let us go to the anatomy of the pericardium. The outer layer is known as the fibrous pericardium. The inner layer is a double layered, the one which is in proximity with the heart is known as a visceral layer or an epicardium. That means this is the one which covers the heart and the great vessels also. And then the third is it gets reflected back to form a parietal pericardium which lines the fibrous pericardium. So I'll explain it again. So normally there is about varying amount of fluid, a normal pericardial fluid between the two inner layers. So to make it more simple, the most outermost is the fibrous pericardium. Then when the one which layers inside the fibrous pericardium is known as a parietal pericardium, and the one which covers the heart and the great vessel is known as a serous or an epicardium. So that is the usual anatomy. Now, what I'm going to discuss, I'm not going to discuss a very difficult subject like constrictive pericarditis, but some of the common things which you feel you are getting in day-to-day practice. First diagnostic approach, clinical evaluation, clinical evaluation, clinical evaluation. Don't jump to the echo. Just have a good history and a clinical examination, which is the most important part. So now out of these, coming to acute pericarditis, 2 to 4 of these need be present because all four is not present, and this is according to the European Society of Cardiology that a chest pain sometimes relieved in a particular posture, like the patient sitting up, bending forward, or like this. A pericardial rub on auscultation. Thirdly, a sequential ECG changes, which are very uncommon. There, although a lot of stress has been paid on it, but many times you may not see, or you may see some changes, but it may not be sequential and new or increasing pericardial effusion, and then it lasts for usually less than 4 to 6 weeks or so. So these are the 1, 2, 3, 4 criteria of which two should be satisfied to diagnose acute pericarditis. Now this is what the ECG says. Now you don't see all stages. In stage 1, they say there is a PR depression and there is a generalized ST segment elevation. Generalized ST segment elevation. Then in the second stage, which is the stage 2 or the early stage, the PR interval tends to disappear and the J point comes at the baseline, and then the T waves come to us. Most of the time we see a case, we see this case in which there is a T wave inversion generalized, which do not correspond to any anatomic territory of the coronary vessels, or we see an ST elevation. Then in the last stage, there may be completely normal ECG. That is why they say that ECG changes may be really very uncommon. So so these are some of the things. And then there is a second condition known as a recurrent pericarditis. You are getting mostly cases of pericardial effusion, but any of these conditions can produce a recurrent pericarditis. The recurrent pericarditis, just in one slide, is a recurrence of after a symptomatic free period of 4 to 6 weeks. So that means there is a symptomatic free period of 4 to 6 weeks, especially those not treated with cholecystitis initially. It is one of the most important anti-inflammatory agent also colchicine, and it is very widely used in European countries also for the treatment of pericarditis. Incidence is about 30%. Symptoms are all like an acute pericarditis, including ECG, but the only thing is there is a symptom-free interperiod, and then there is a new pericardial effusion. So you must know some of these two aspects of a acute pericarditis and a recurrent pericarditis. Now coming to a pericardial effusion, which is the most important thing, it is classically seen as an echo-free space throughout the cardiac cycle. throughout the cardiac cycle, and never and always use multiple scan planes, including the subcostal, which can be give you more information. Sometimes you may see a systolic separation. For example, we'll show you. And then the most important is a diastolic separation and quantitation. So what you do in an echo, number one, is whether pericardial effusion is present or not, or whether it is a physiological or a pathological one, and what is the approximate mild, moderate, or severe. And these are extra information to be provided, whether it is a global, localized, and what is the appearance of the fluid or so. So coming to the systolic separation, you see here, this is a parasternal long axis view. You see here, and there is a small echo-free space, but this is usually seen during systole, and that is why this is known more like an uh, physiological effusion. Because why? Because it is seen only in systole, while a classical pericardial effusion should be seen in diastole. For example, if you see the same M mode, we always reduce the gain to see better. Now you see there is an echo-free space only in systole, but not in diastole. So again you see echo-free space only in systole, not in diastole. So that means this is more of a physiological pericardial effusion, which is usually present about a fluid in the lungs or in the heart or so. Now, as I said, diastolic separation, here you see an echo-free space both in systole and diastole. So this is more pathognomic of a pericardial effusion, and you see it is neither, it is also present in diastole. So that is the first thing you see in these when you do these cases. Then what is quantitation? It is an approximate semi-quantitation. You see, you see the distribution of the fluid, and what is it? Diastolic echo-free space. Remember, the end diastolic echo-free space is counted, not the systolic echo-free space. Now you see here, when there is a systolic separation, which I showed you just now, that is a trivial. When the echo-free space is less than 10 millimeters, it is usually small, and it is usually seen only in a posterior location. So less than 10 millimeters is small. When it is between 10 to 20 millimeters, that means near about 500 ml fluid is present, and which is mostly circumferential. More than 20 millimeters echo-free space means there is more than 500 ml of fluid, again circumstantial, and very large is more than 25. That means there is a large pericardial effusion. So less than 10 small, 10 to 20 moderate, more than 20 large, and more than 25 very large. So that is the a semi-quantitative determination, and that too in echo-free space. For example, here you see, as I told you, it is also present in the whole cardiac cycle, both in the systole and diastole. And if you measure in diastole, this will come to be very small pericardial effusion. Because if you measure in diastole also, you will see just hardly about 3 to 4 millimeters. Now, as you see here, say here you see now that it is more of a moderate pericardial effusion. Now, although I cannot ask you questions or so, but I call what is known as a White syndrome. If you find anything abnormal in an echo, can anyone tell what is abnormal in this echo? So you see, without wasting a time, this is a moderate pericardial effusion because it is more than 10, less than 20. But an unusual feature is there is a significant RV enlargement. And you see there is a flattening of the septum and RV. So why should there be such a different RV enlargement also, and a flattening of the septum in a simple pericardial effusion. So that is all I call a White syndrome. That means that you should explain why this is happening. And when we see all the view, the same patient had an Easton's anomaly. So you see there is a marked separation of the septum in the LV and prominent anti-leaflet, and there is a it lies all signs of a Easton's anomaly associated with a pericardial effusion. Just this is just out of clinical interest. So coming to this again, you see here, this is a large pericardial effusion because it is more than 20 millimeters, whether we measure it or not. And when we measured, it was much more than that. So here you see always anterior and posterior. There is an anterior echo-free space. This is the right ventricular wall, and this is the anterior echo-free space, and this is the posterior echo-free space. So that means this patient must be having a circumferential or a large pericardial effusion, and you see this. So we have shown you a, a, a small a small pericardial effusion, a moderate pericardial effusion less than 20 millimeters. Then we have shown you a large pericardial effusion which is more than 20 millimeters of mercury. Oh, sorry, millimeters. Now, if this would have been an open session, I would have asked you. This patient was referred for a pericardial tapping on an urgent basis. On an urgent basis, that there is a large pericardial effusion. When we did an echo, we said, "Bilkul, nothing to worry, let the patient relax." Why? Because this was a pleural effusion. Why pleural effusion? You see, this is a descending aorta. Any effusion which is posterior to the descending aorta is a pleural effusion. Usually, this pleural effusion goes behind the left atrium throughout rather than the beginning of the left atrium. So two things told us that this is a large echo-free space behind the descending aorta, which is extending into the behind the left atrium. So please take him to the department and get a pleural tap done. So you see this is a sort of frozen image. You see the first of all frozen that this is a descending aorta, and this is a echo-free space behind it, and this is the left atrium. And you see again the same thing behind the descending aorta and going behind the atrium. So any effusion behind the atrium, descending aorta, is pleural, and anything which is anterior to it is the pericardial. Now you see, this is a pleural. Why? I told you because it is behind the descending aorta and going beyond this. And why this is a pericardial effusion? It is anterior to the descending aorta and doesn't go behind the left atrium. So I think now with these so many slides, you should be very clear how to avoid. Otherwise, somebody would have put a needle into the pericardium, all would have. So I've shown you this again. See, make an impression on your mind. This is posterior to the descending aorta, going behind the left atrium, and this is a pericardium which is anterior to the descending aorta and does not go behind the left atrium. So these are the differentiating features between the pericardial effusion or so. So another you see, here you see that there is a diffuse, that is why I said a subcostal view is also very important. Now you see there is a diffuse pericardial effusion, complete circumferential pericardial effusion, and also here you can see it is both anterior and posterior. Both of them are there fluid. And in a subcostal view, it is a circumferential large. So this forms into the group of a large pericardial effusion. So now you should not be confused too much according to how to quantitate. And this is sometimes we show you, I will show you that sometimes we can see even what type of fluid it is. You see, this is the blue fusion. This is such an exudative sort of a echo-free space. Exudative mass. Although this patient had suspicion of a constrictive pericarditis, but you see, beyond this, beyond the pericardium, in the fluid area, you see a very large sort of a mass, which will further increase the next day, and told us that it is more of a either an highly exudative or a purulent sort of a structure. So we can get an idea, but ultimately it has to be the pleural tap also. So you see, so you not only see the fusion, but you see what are the structure type present in this fusion. Sometimes you can find when we get an isolated anterior echo-free space, we don't give much importance because sometimes what is known as a epicardial fat pad, but suppose a patient has got a any intervention done, then sometimes it can be localized into the anterior effusion. Otherwise, usually the pleural pericardial effusion is posteriorly, and if it is associated, the anterior echo-free space, anterior effusion, is more associated with a posterior pericardial effusion. But that depends upon the situation. We hardly see so much of thymus and fibrous tissue, but an epicardial fat pad is found in obesity, metabolic syndromes, and all these fats can produce an isolated echo-free space, which is isolated anterior. Now we come to a pericardial tamponade, which is now the first few slides will be a bit confusing for you, but if you try, you will get some sort of a idea for this. Now, this pericardial tamponade is a life-threatening condition, especially after any intervention. Suppose a patient is undergone bypass surgery. He has got a pericardial, he has done a angiography, angioplasty. Then it can be a life-threatening condition when you develop it. It depends upon the rate of fluid accumulation and the volume of fluid accumulation. I will explain to you just now. And some features can be like a large effusion. What I was explaining to this is that you see, even a 100 ml of a rapidly accumulating pericardial effusion can produce a rapid tamponade by rapidly increasing the intrapericardial pressure. While those patients who gradually develop a pericardial effusion, then the pericardium is compliant, it gradually accumulates and more volume than it picked up. So the rate and the volume, why the rate is here, a rapid onset even of a small volume can produce a tamponade, while a slow tamponade of a large volume can provide a, a tamponade. So that it depends upon the rate and the volume of the flow. And I hope it is clear by the diagram. I've shown you this thing that you see here. There is a rapid increase in the intrapericardial volume and leading to intracardiac pressure with a small amount. Here you see as the fluid gradually accumulates, the pericardium starts getting stretching and adapting, and it can accumulate. And when there is a large volume over a period of time, that is known as a slow tamponade, and this is known as a rapid tamponade, mostly found after any intervention or any trauma also. So remember, slow and rapid. Now, what happens in cardiac tamponade? The pericardial pressure increases more than the intracardiac pressure in all chambers. As you know, the visceral pericardium is lining the heart, all the chambers. So when there is a increase in the pericardial pressure, the, it will increase the intracardiac pressure. So again, I told you this pressure will depend upon the volume and the rate of accumulation. So what happens when there is a pericardial pressure increases or pericardial fluid increases, there is a compression of the cardiac chambers, because they are, after all, the cardiac chambers are being surrounded by pericardium. So when there is a large pericardial effusion, whether slow or immediately, it presses upon the chambers, and there and when they are pressed, their their feeling is impaired because they are already impaired. So the main thing to remember is that if the slide is that once there is an increase in the pericardial pressure, it produces a chamber compression of all the chambers, and the filling of that chamber is restricted because the pericardial fluid is there. Now, now come the same thing. You see why the pericardial tamponade or a large pericardial effusion is misinterpreted at other diseases. Why? Say because there is an elevation of filling pressure in all the chambers. That means because they are being compressed by pericardial, and when there's increased LA pressure, because after all this is also part of the heart, the increased pressure is transmitted back into the pulmonary veins, leading to pulmonary congestion, and the patient presents with dyspnea and cough because of this. On the right side, because of the increased RA pressure, there is raised JVP, edema feed, ascites, and low cardiac output. So this is because of I brought this slide just to tell you that what happens when there is increased LA pressure or increased RA pressure, and that includes all the chambers. Now, two important slides. You should be awake now. These are the fundamental pathophysiological mechanisms. There are two things, whether it is tamponade or whether it is constrictive pericarditis, both have got similar findings. And there are two things. One is exaggerated ventricular interdependence. I'll explain. And then dissociation between intrathoracic and intracardiac pressure with respiration. Now let us come to one. Try to understand, nothing worry. I say there is a fixed volume in the heart, whether it is a constrictive pericarditis or pericardial effusion. Suppose the fixed cardiac volume, I'm saying the rough example is 100. Suppose the LV has got 60, the RV has got 40. Suppose the LV becomes from 60 to 55. To maintain that 100, RV goes from 40 to 45. Suppose the LV goes to 40, then the RV goes to 60. So that means both the chambers are interdependent on each other. That is, the alteration in volume of one chamber must by necessity reflected by a change in volume in another chamber. If in one chamber the volume increases, other decreases. If in one chamber the volume decreases, other increases. This is known as ventricular interdependence. So that when there is a reduced LV filling, there will be increased RV filling. Clear? Because of interdependence, and this will explain to you again. So that because if there is reduced filling in one chamber, so that means less volume in that chamber, so increased filling will be in the another chamber. So this is known as a ventricular interdependence, which is aggravated in pericardial tamponade also, and we'll explain to you just now further by echo slides. Another very difficult slide, but very easy to understand. Say intrathoracic and the intracardiac pressure. In a normal individual, during inspiration, the intrathoracic pressure tends to decrease, and there is a similar decrease in all intracardiac pressures. So if the if the pulmonary venous pressure decreases, all the pressures decrease. So when all the pressure decrease, there is a maintained flow from pulmonary vein to LA to LV. So when the pressures are similar in all the chambers, The normally filling is from pulmonary vein to LA to LV. So there is no significant respiratory variation. What happens in tamponade? That the heart is pressed by the fluid, large amount of fluid, so it cannot expand fully because there is a pressure. And because there is an increased pressure in all the cardiac chambers, I told you, so there is an increase in the LA pressure also, like other things. Because, because the pulmonary vein is an intrathoracic structure, during inspiration, the pulmonary venous pressure decreases, while LA pressure does not decrease or remains enlarged. So the decreased flow from pulmonary vein to LA. Flow is always from a high pressure to a low pressure. So what happens that there is a decreased flow because pulmonary venous flow has become decreased because of it has got intrathoracic pressure decreased, but LA gradient is the same. So they decreased in LA flow. Why there is a decrease in LA flow? Because LA pressure is increased and it is being filled by the pulmonary vein. So that is why it is filled. I give the same example that if you have to push a 50 kilo person, you require less pressure. If you have to put a 90 kilo patient, you require a more weight. So this is like a 90 kg and this is a small. So decreased flow from pulmonary vein to LA to LV. So what happens during inspiration? Because of a permanent increase in the LA pressure, there is a decreased flow from pulmonary vein to LA, and when there is a decreased flow from pulmonary vein to LA, so there is a decreased flow from LA to LV. So when there is a decreased flow from LV to LV, there is a decreased LV filling, and because of a ventricular interdependence, when there is a decreased ventricular filling, there is an increased RV filling. This because they had to compensate according to each other. And this is what is known as the respiratory variation, which will be show you just now. So here there is no fall in increase, or there is no chamber increased pressure. So all of them maintain the flow. But here, because of a decreased flow from pulmonary vein to LA and less to pulmonary vein, so when the LV is getting less blood, its filling is reduced, and hence the RV filling has to be increased. So now you see this is known as a ventricular interdependence. Now during inspiration, as we have seen, that there is more filling of the RV because you see during inspiration, because there is a less filling of LV, there is more filling of RV. So when there is a more filling of RV, then the septum is deviated towards the left side because septum is between the LV and the RV. So says now what happens in expiration? When in inspiration the RV was more filling and LV was less filling, opposite thing occurs in expiration when the LV filling is increased and you see the septum now moves toward the LV. And sometimes this is supposed to be the cause of this pulsus paradoxus because less stroke volume. So just see RV increases, LV decreases, in expiration LV increases, RV decreases. This is known as the ventricular interdependence because the flow depends upon each other. So similarly, what we were talking of respiration. Now you see from the left side. During inspiration, the left side filling was decreased, correct? So the right side filling was increased. You can see this is the tricuspid wall. Right side filling was increased, left side filling was decreased. And when the expiration occurs, more filling occurs of the left ventricle and less of the right ventricle, so their flow becomes less. So during inspiration, there is a decrease in the mitral velocity, and during expiration, there is an increase in the mitral velocity because of an increased filling. The reverse occurs because of ventricular interdependence, as during inspiration, because of the less filling of RV, there is more filling of RV, less filling of LV, more filling of RV. So the tricuspid wall velocity increases, or the reverse occurs in, in this. Now, suppose you see what we have shown you just now. You see, this is a This is a respirometer. This is inspiration and this is expiration. This is inspiration, the one going up and the one going down this place. Now you see what is happening during inspiration, the mitral valve velocity decreases because of less of LV filling. During expiration, the mitral valve velocity is increased because more of the filling occurs in the left ventricle. This is seen in every view. Again, you see this is inspiration. The first beat in inspiration shows less velocity. Here you see, and as soon as expiration starts, this is the velocity increases. And this is calculated by the formula expiration minus inspiration divided by expiration into 100. So this gave us a value of a 30% of a respiratory variation, which is abnormal. Normally should be in about 10, 15 or like this or so. So this is just to show you what we have told you diagrammatically, that this is inspiration, expiration. And this is because of an increased RV filling and less LV filling, and this is expiration when there is an increased RV filling. So because if there is an inspiratory increase in RV, then at least there should be expiratory increase in LV also, because LV has also the fill, it will not depend upon the RV. So you can see these two very classical examples. Now see again, you see the tricuspid valve again. During inspiration, because more flow goes into the RV, there is an increase in the flow, in the velocity of the RV as compared to the expiration when the more flow goes into the LV. And this is shown here. You see this is expiration, inspiration, more flow into this, and this is expiration, less flow now. So this is increased filling during inspiration, and this is you see that it is opposite of this. Here in inspiration there was less filling, expiration was more filling in mitral valve, and here you see during inspiration there was more filling of the tricuspid valve because of this same present told, and the expiration it is much decreased, and the variation was about 40%. So this is what is known as a ventricular interdependence and dissociation between intrathoracic and intracardiac pressure. I told you the few slides may be difficult, but I've tried to explain to you in a very simple manner. So now what is the diagnosis of a tamponade? It depends upon the presence of the varying degrees of effusion. Number one, as I told you, we forget about it. We'll tell you again this thing later on. So there has to be an effusion. If there is no effusion, then we think of constrictive pericarditis. So there has to be some degree of effusion, whether it's small, medium, or large. This enlarged inferior vena cava will decrease collapse. Very important finding. Why? Because as I told you, there is an increase in all the chambers, pressures in the chamber. So as you have seen before in many conditions, when the RA pressure increases, the IVC also increases in size and there's a decreased collapse. As I have told you before, that whenever any chamber which is subjected to increased pressure is increasing in size, so because of an increased RA pressure, all the strain falls on the inferior vena cava, it becomes enlarged and the decrease becomes collapse. Then there are certain, we'll come to it again, a diastolic collapse also. Now you see, this is what is I told you, ventricular interdependence. Now you see, this is inspiration. During inspiration, what happens? The RV increases in size, correct? Because more flow go into the RV. As a result of which, the septum is pushed posteriorly, reducing the LV size. Now, during expiration, as the LV filling increases, LV filling decreases. So this is, we have shown, this is known as the ventricular interdependence. This was a case of a constrictive pericarditis, so I got the same pattern. Just to show you that even by M mode echo of a parasternal long axis, you can show a ventricular interdependence, an increase in the RV filling during inspiration, and increase of the LV filling during expiration, and reciprocal changes. Now you see in a pericardial effusion tamponade, you see this is a pericardial fluid. It is about 25 millimeters. We measure in diastole, it is about 25 millimeters. That means this is a large one or so. Now this is inspiration. As you see during inspiration, the RV increases. See, you see, compare from here. This is RV, this is RV, this is RV, and here the RV increases. Then during expiration, you see the LV. Here, here increases. So the RV becomes short and LV becomes large. So this is known as a ventricular interdependence, which is diagnosed only by you just see. These are the LA before the inspiration, and after inspiration you see how the RV increases in size. You see this is LV during inspiration, during expiration how it increases in size and pushes the septum on the opposite side and the presence of a large pericardial effusion. So this is one of the signs of this. So and you see it enlarged IVC is and a decreased collapse is almost found in 92% of cases. It is believed that absence of this sign in absence of a diuresis always questions the diagnosis. So whenever we get a case of a pericardial tamponade, and as soon as we see the IVC, it has to be enlarged and decreased. And if it is not enlarged and doesn't show normal collapse, we try to find out if the patient has received diuretics. If no, then we'll question our diagnosis. So a, a I have shown you this ventricular interdependence, very important diagnosis, and I've shown you a this very you can see it decreased collapse. And this is out of clinical interest. This is sometimes what we find in a constrictive pericarditis, or you can sometimes find in a pericardial tamponade, a large pericardium, a IVC, hardly collapsing with a multiple spontaneous contrast at a low flow state. So these two signs are very important. Then there is known as an RV diastolic collapse. Now why? In pericardial effusion, I told you that the intracardiac pressure becomes more than the intracardiac pressure, intrapericardial pressure. And a chamber is compressed when its pressure is least. So when the RV early diastolic pressure is least, then this pressure produces a collapse of the right ventricle, which is known as an early diastolic RV collapse. And the same thing happens on the right atrial side because its pressure is least during late diastole or even in systole. So whenever a chamber has got a least pressure in that situation, then that with collapses because of this intrapericardial pressure. Now you see here, I'll explain to you, you'll get it better. Now you see this is a pericardial effusion. This is both anterior and posterior. It's almost like a swinging heart. Now I know you'll not appreciate here, but you see a notch coming in the right ventricle. This notch is known as the right ventricular diastolic collapse. I will explain to you further better now. This is the same patient with a normal image, still image. You see this is the right ventricle wall, right atrial, right side pericardial effusion, anterior, posterior. No notch here. You see, in diastole, there is a notch here. You see diastole because the mitral wall is open. So now you can appreciate this if you can appreciate this. That during this, you see what I told you that during, if you can't see this, at least see the mitral wall and you see this is the notch. And this is this and this is the notch. And if you are lucky, what you do can you can take an M mode picture of this, and you see M mode. This is diastolic collapse. This is systole. This is diastolic, and there's a diastolic collapse of the right ventricular wall. This one. This is an M mode picture to this. All this is shown, and then, but you see, it is not a very specific sign. It is sometimes when there is a pulmonary hypertension, you may not see this. Whenever there's many, for example, here you can see this case. It has got nothing to do with pericardial effusion, a minimal pericardial this, no increase in heart rate, but you see a diastolic collapse of the RV. So that means there might be some strain, but not typical of the pericardial effusion. You see, so, and sometimes you see the more important is the RA collapse. You see now, you see number one, there is a swinging motion of the heart. There is a collapse of the right ventricle. And then you see, it's the more the collapse is the more the inversion is in systole, the better, the more severe it is. For example, RA late systolic or a systolic collapse, and you see, so this is LV, this is RV, are in the same picture shows a diastolic collapse of the RV, and you see multiple marked inversion, and the greater it lies in systole, the more severe is the tamponade. Now again, a word of caution. The same patient I told you, say sometimes in our normal patients we see this type of inversion because RV wall is very thin, but it does not go much more into the systole, and there are no other signs of a of cardiac tamponade. Here you see. So somebody, if you are not careful, somebody will diagnose it as a sort of a collapse. Now see this again this is one of our patients. You will see it quite commonly. Now here you see there is no evidence of any there was no evidence of any temporal, but you see there can be an inversion. Sometimes they say that this may be a sign of a right atrial effusion. An effusion behind the right atrium can produce this sort of a brief inversion. So the summary of the findings are a clinical, very important, fever, dyspnea, cough, tachycardia, presence of a pericardial effusion, swinging heart, what I showed you just now, IVC changes, what I showed you just now, Doppler parameters of the mitral and the tricuspid wall, which I showed you just now, RA collapse and RV diastolic collapse, which we have shown all these things into this. So the take-home message is do a good clinical evaluation. Correlate clinical and echo findings. As I said, don't go by one finding or so. Correlate clinical. Suppose you find a bit of a diastolic collapse. See all other things, that whatever there or not or no, and see whether they match with the other findings or so. Always do a full echo evaluation. Scan all views, including subcostal. Don't leave yourself the best two views otherwise can be parasternal long axis, short axis, and the subcostal view. They can be the best views, but sometimes you can see this collapse much better in the subcostal view. And the semi-quantitation of effusion you must get. Remember, a large pericardial effusion can mimic tamponade. So sometimes when you see these findings, whether it is a large pericardial effusion, whether it's tamponade, we always write in our report, suggested a pericardial stenosis on a priority basis. Now, one question and one problem which you will face, that how do you diagnose respiratory changes if you don't have a respirometer in your equipment? Long time back, what we used to do, We used to put a stomach on the fat when he was inspiration, expiration. Then later on, the literature came that when you are doing a Doppler of the mitral wall, the lowest velocity always comes during inspiration. That remember, forget. Even if you don't have a respirometer, the lowest velocity is always in inspiration is the mitral, and the next highest may be the largest velocity, and you compare between the two. The same on the right side. The largest velocity the lowest will always be in tricuspid and lowest, and the highest will be expiratory. So that is why even if you don't have a respirometer, remember this basic dictum that if you are doing, and what we do in this case is we reduce the speed. We reduce the speed of the recording so that you can get a large number of complexes. So for example, I'll just show you. Say you see here, we have reduced the speed so that we can get a large number of complexes. And you see, even if I had no respirometer with me, you see the lowest velocity always comes during inspiration. So that is the catch point for you. Again, here also take a maximum of this, and even without, and you that means you should get more complexes also. And remember, without respirometer, the maximum is in its expiration, minimum is in expiration. So I hope certain points have been clarified with you. So that the most important point was this, which many questions have asked us, and we have found the answer for this. Now, any questions or anything now from your side? Nina, can anybody unmute and go on asking questions? Or either you have understood everything or understood nothing? Because,
Huh,
huh,
Sir, I think no questions from any other delegate side.
so at least,
Sir, excuse me, sir.
yeah.
Sir, please explain once again effect of diuretics on pericardial effusions.
See, when I meant, I said, I told IVC. Now, when you give too much of diuretics, the intracardiac volume decreases also. So sometimes you get, so you, if there's an absence of diuresis also, because you have, by diuresis, you exclude lot of fluid also, reduced RA pressure to IVC may not get these classical findings. But this is very important. So that is the road. We only don't give so much of diuresis also, because most of the patients are sent to the ward for paracardiocentesis. But if there is a delay, then one can give a diuretic also. But when the patient comes to you and you find that the IVC is normal, then you have to ask whether he has got any injections or not. But majority of them will have a pericardial effusion and some changes also. What my point was that this is an important prerequisite for the diagnosis, almost in about 92% cases.
Sir, is there any criteria for pericardial effusion by quantitation? How much amount should be minimum to tap it?
No. Tap it. Say, why do you tap? You tap for two reasons. Number one, to relieve the patient of symptoms, and number to find out the diagnosis. What is what is the diagnosis? Now, when there is a very small amount of fluid, then you may not, suppose it is less than 200 or less than like this. Then what we try to do is large pericardial effusions more than about 10 millimeters need aspiration. But otherwise, if it is small pericardial effusion, you just need a small bit to get a diagnostic cytology done. So it depends on, there are number of cases of pericardial effusions in which they don't tap, and they
More
just
than,
give us, for
if
example,
it is more, sorry, if it is more than 10 mm, then we should have. You mean to
yes,
say?
then you should, because now I can tell you that some persons are very sort of very scared of using this tapping or so, but otherwise I will say ki, despite our saying, uh, this patient was also not tapped, which I showed you a pericardial effusion with an Eastern anomaly. But definitely you have to see clinically how much comfortable the patient is. What is happening, to be very frank with you, many of the cardiologists do not like to uh, put a tab, but now what they do is they put a needle followed by a cath, and that catheter goes on getting training into it, so that they don't have to go repeatedly also. So it is not that only symptom also, but the quantity of fluid. You don't know when it will suddenly increase also. So after more than 10 millimeters, I think one needs to do. Otherwise, if the diagnosis is very clear, they put anti-tubercle or they just take out a small amount of fluid. But then others say that once you are already putting a needle inside to take out a small amount of fluid, why not drain what is there inside?
So in absence of cardiac tamponade, we can go for the pericardial tapping if the fluid
If
is
there
more
is
than.
no, as I told you that if tamponade and the signs of a large pericardial effusion, you don't know when these patients may suddenly go into tamponade. So large pericardial effusion, no doubt about it, they have to be tapped. And that, of course, nowadays they put a, after a needle, they put a guide wire and put a catheter so that it goes on training for the next 24 hours or so.
Okay.
You have to see symptoms, blood pressure, any dyspnea, pulsus paradoxus, and many other things. But when it is large, it has to be trained also. And when there is a post-intervention, then it has to be tapped immediately. So
Okay.
then it can be life-saving.
Thank you.
So what I suggest that today or tomorrow, spare some time and read uh, pericardial tamponade or a large pericardial effusion. And just keep those two slides in mind, a ventricular interdependence and a dissociation of intrathoracic and intracardiac pressure. If there's any doubt, you contact us. Because these two, I personally did not bring it constrictive pericarditis because even many top persons miss it and then it would have confused you more. But their signs are much more like a pericardial effusion. So try to read today and don't leave it for some other day. And anything which is not clear, please contact us and we will show you it. From our side, we have shown you all the possible signs which you are expected to see. And luckily, whenever you start an echo, you always start from a parastern and a long axis view. And that is why you can always see this ventricular interdependence even without a respirometer or so if possible. So, anybody else wants?
Sir, I think no questions from the delegate side, so
So ठीक है then.
we can wind up right now.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. Thank you for your kind
Thank you.
support.
Thank you.
Okay, right,
Thank you.
sir. Thank you, sir.